Hi, I'm Sherry Vegas, and in this resin tutorial today we're going to be talking about layer lines. So layer lines or pour lines, whatever you like to call them, are basically as you pour multiple layers into like a resin casting piece, you will see a really slight line for each layer. And so a question I get asked a lot is how do you avoid getting layer lines in your work, especially when you're doing clear casting works like putting flowers in resin, because you can see them. And honestly, layer lines are pretty much unavoidable. There is a technique you can do to try to minimize them as much as possible, but there are some risks when doing that technique. So if you're brand new into resin and you don't wonder why you just do one big pour, especially when you're working with a natural item like flowers, is that it can overheat the resin and cook the flowers, and it will create an exothermic reaction, which basically a lot of resins, epoxy resins, are designed to be cast at a certain depth. So say 1 centimeter to 2 centimeters. So if you did one big pour with a resin like that, it's obviously a lot deeper and it will create that exothermic reaction, which will then heat the resin up a lot, and you'll find that it will cook the item that is inside because it gets very hot, and you'll get tons of bubbles and the resin will yellow. And so we don't want that. So that's why you do multiple layers when you do a piece like this. Now that is for shallow casting resin. Obviously deep pour resin is its own different category. The reason why you mostly use shallow casting resin when you're doing flowers and stuff like that is, one, it prevents it from overheating, and two, because the bubbles will, these items generally have a lot of bubbles in them, and so if you do a big deep pour, sometimes you can get lots of bubbles trapped in, but if you do lots of shallow pours, it's a lot easier to get those bubbles out. And also too, even if you did go for a really deep pour resin, something that could be poured at this depth, you would still need to do at least like 2 to 3 layers, because you need to do your first layer of resin, which will then be able to place your items in and then let that set to then be able to do the next layer. So you would still have to do at least 1 layer to have all of those items set in, because if you just did one big deep pour, your flowers are just going to float to the top of the surface because they're a lot less dense than the resin. So you're still going to have at least 1 layer line no matter which way you go about it. Now I did say at the start there is a technique you can use that will help minimize layer lines, but there is a caveat to it that if you don't do it 100% correctly, it can end up ruining your whole piece. So a lot of the time I just don't bother and I'm just happy with the layer lines, because at least I'm not risking that chance of completely ruining a piece. So this piece here, I have done that technique and I'll do a close-up, but you can barely see the layer lines in this. And for a piece this deep, I think I've got about 5 or 6 layer lines in this because I used a shallow casting resin. And basically the technique to avoiding layer lines is not letting your resin fully set up before you pour your next layer. So normally, depending on the type of resin you're using, say it has a 12-hour curing time. So it's recommended after that 12 hours you can pour the next layer. If you go in before that has fully cured, so say you go in at the 6-hour mark or even the 3-hour mark, when you pour the next layer of resin on, because that first layer hasn't fully cured, you'll find that they'll kind of blend together and you won't get those super distinct layer lines because the first part of resin hasn't fully cured, and then you're pouring a fresh batch of resin on top, and it helps minimize those layer lines. So if there is a way around preventing the layer lines from pouring your resin, why wouldn't you use it? The reason behind that is, and this is what I said previously about the resin overheating, having that exothermic reaction because you've poured it too deep, because the more depth to your resin, the hotter it will get. So if your resin has just been poured like 3 hours or 6 hours ago, but it has a full 12 hours for it to start to cure before it's recommended to pour the next layer, that resin will still contain heat. And then by adding another fresh layer on top, you're now going to have the heat from the fresh layer plus the heat from the previous layer together, and you're going to have a depth that's over that recommended guideline, which it can cause it to amber and have bubbles. So you have to be really cautious if you are going to try this method that you don't have too much heat already from that first layer before you pour that second layer. So it's a really fine line between pouring it soon enough that both layers will blend together, but not pouring it soon enough where you're going to get that exothermic reaction happening because there's still too much heat on the first layer, and then you've added that second layer, which then will add more heat to the piece. And that is why there is always that recommended wait time before doing the next layer, because that allows the resin to fully cure and lose all of that heat before you do add that next layer on. But that also means you're going to get that distinctive layer line. But it also means that you're not going to have a chance of ruining your piece. And the reason why this is quite a hard technique to do, and one that I recommend just avoiding if you are a beginner, is because there are so many variables in this. If your temperature of the room is too hot, that's going to affect it. The type of resin you're using, the timing on when you do it, because different resins have different curing times, the temperature of the first layer and how deep you poured that first layer and how deep you're going to pour that second layer. So you've got so many variables happening that there is a really high risk of just ruining it by pouring too soon. So if you are new to resin, I recommend not trying this, or trying it on a few pieces that you don't really care if they do turn yellow, go that amber tone, or get lots of air bubbles, because you're not too fussed. It's just a practice run, because it is so easy to screw it up. One of my biggest tips, if you do want to do it, is get yourself a thermometer, one of the thermal ones, and check the temperature of that first layer of resin. You would want it to be under 15 or 20 before you even thought about mixing up that next layer of resin to pour on top. And obviously do it at the coolest point in the day if you don't have aircon, because you need that resin to be as cool as possible before adding that next layer on. But you always do run the risk of it turning amber over time. And I have a really good example right here. So this piece was looking so good and it doesn't turn amber straight away. So that's something too that you also need to keep in mind. I'll add a clip up now of what this piece looked like. I think I took this video 2 weeks after I had finished this piece, and you can see it looks crystal clear. I've got no ambering whatsoever, but you can see now it has clearly changed color. And when I turn it on its side, you can see I've just got one really amber layer, and that's because I've poured this layer too soon and it's obviously overheated. And sometimes it doesn't go amber straight away. It takes weeks for it to color change, but that is what happens if you pour your layers too soon. And I thought I had given this plenty of time, but obviously there was still some heat before I poured. I did cut down the working time a little bit, and it was a hotter day, which is my mistake. And look at that difference between the previous layers and this layer. So this is the risk that you run if you do try to do this technique to avoid those layer lines. So I would just say it's just better to wait the full amount of time before doing the next pour. Otherwise you run that risk of ruining your whole piece.